How does a community of nearly 1,000 people end up dying in the middle of a jungle? Good morning, afternoon, or evening, lovelies, and welcome to the first episode of Paige's Offline Horn, where we explore the dark, disturbing, and criminal stories that unfold away from the internet. Today, we will deep dive into one of the most devastating events in the 20th century, the Jonestown massacre. This video isn't about shock value or horror for entertainment's sake. It's about understanding how a movement built on hope became a cautionary tale of control, psychological manipulation, and coercive power. We'll explore who Jim Jones was, how he gained influence, what life was really like in Jonestown, and how it came to its tragic end. I'll also be weaving in the psychological theories that help explain how this happened, including how isolation and obedience to authority can quietly dismantle critical thinking and individual will. Please be advised that this episode contains sensitive subject, including suicide, child death, emotional manipulation, and mentions of abuse. It's okay to pause or step away if you need to. With all that in mind, let's begin with the man who promised paradise and led his followers into the jungle, Jim Jones. To understand Jim Jones, we need to go back, way back, to his parents. His father, James Thurman Jones, was the son of John Henry Jones and Mary Catherine Shank. Now, John Jones was a respected man. He was old school, the kind that believed that if you worked hard, you'd make something of yourself. And most of his kids did just that. They got married, found stable jobs, and lived decent lives. But James, he was different. His family didn't think he'd ever settle down, even going as far as to call him a forever bachelor. And then came the war. James served in World War I, where he was exposed to a chemical gas attack, a common and devastating weapon at the time. It scorched the lungs from the inside out, causing chronic respiratory issues, shortness of breath, and relentless coughing. James would struggle with these ailments the rest of his life, making it difficult for him to work for extended periods of time. He did, however, marry a woman named Lynetta Putnam. She was younger, possibly around 15 years, though records are kind of murky. Lynetta was ambitious, but not entirely in the modern traditional sense. She'd grown up poor, and to her, marrying into a rich family was the way out. It wasn't uncommon at the time for women to seek stability through marriage, but when she tied the knot with James, things didn't quite go as she planned. Lynetta expected the Jones family to support them, but this was the period of the Great Depression, and everyone was struggling financially. Furthermore, John Jones wasn't interested in handouts. To him, letting them struggle was a sign of respect, giving them room to figure it out for themselves. Nevertheless, he gave the couple a small farm in Crete, Indiana. A gesture, not a solution, and it didn't stick. Lynetta hated farm life. James, sick and getting worse, couldn't keep up with the physical demands. And then, in the middle of it all, on May the 13th of 1931, Jim Jones was born. However, soon after his birth, his father suffered a complete breakdown and had to be hospitalized. From the start, life was hard. The family depended almost entirely on James's military pension. Eventually, they couldn't even keep the farm. The Jones family helped relocate them to Lynn, Indiana in 1934 so that they could be closer to the rest of the family. A new town, a small house still. With James unable to work due to his health, the family agreed to help out, though only until Jim was a toddler. At that point, Lynetta would be expected to find a job. The Great Depression led to an increase in the number of women in the workforce, though they were usually in small roles that didn't pay well. Women were still likely to be secondary earners to their husbands, and their career life would likely be short. So even though Lynetta would get a job in a factory, the Jones family still struggled. Lynetta wasn't happy. She resented her husband, and she didn't keep it to herself either. Everyone knew. Jim Jones didn't have many friends while he was growing up. Even as a child, something about him was off. Neighbors remember strange rituals. He'd hold full-on funerals for dead animals, solemn and dramatic, like he was already playing the part of a preacher. And it wasn't always innocent. There were even reports of him killing a cat. Phyllis Wilmore Zimmerman, someone who knew him back then, would later go on to say he was obsessed with religion. He was obsessed with death. That obsession would become a core part of who he was, woven into everything he did, all the way to the end. Jim wasn't just an outcast in school or in the streets. He was even an outcast at home. His mother worked in a factory, having to be the breadwinner of the home. She paid little attention to Jim. It was a similar story with his father, who had developed a gambling addiction, paying no attention to his son. Jim was left to care for himself. No supervision, no structure, just a boy with a fascination for power, for ritual and control, left to his own devices and already preparing sermons for the dead. As Jones grew up, he graduated from Butler University and ended up marrying his high school sweetheart, Marceline Baldwin, during his freshman year. During university and after, Jones would try out many different denominations of Christianity, but none of them were the right fit for him. He hated the rigid structure of them. The lack of spontaneous preaching made the sermons feel flat. It seemed to him that people cared more about their Sunday afternoon than genuine worship. Furthermore, during the 1950s and 60s, segregation was still rife, something Jones had hated. As a child, his mother would call him ugly for having features associated with that of those of mixed race, and his father was blatantly racist. Jones preferred the African American churches. The joyous and open-ended services appealed to him much more than their counterpart. Upset with the state of the churches, Jones decided to make his own, and in 1956 he established the People's Temple. It was a church that stood out and seemed to stand out for all the right reasons. It was an integrated church. People from all races sat together in unison as they listened to the preaching of Jim Jones, a man who would call out people's names from the crowd and share knowledge no one should know, a man who would miraculously heal people with just a word. However, his miracles didn't always unfold as planned. He was dealing with strangers and he couldn't always rely on them to cooperate. It's suspected that at some point he started using plants. People in his church who he trusted not to tell anyone and to just play along. The church was also known for its charitability, opening a kitchen where not just the homeless, but anyone who was hungry could go and eat. There was also an easy way for members to donate and grab second-hand clothing if they needed them. It also appealed to the youth by setting up dance troupes and church choirs. Jones's reputation continued to grow, bringing in thousands of people. Even newspapers were reporting on the good his church was doing and how it was breaking down walls. Jones wasn't just a preacher, however. He was a master manipulator. He used his empathy to his advantage. He could meet someone and instantly convince them that they shared the same interests, the same issues, and that they needed to work together to solve them. He now had the influence that he desired, and to Jones, the minute he did something for you, you were forever indebted to him. He now owned you. For many people, they weren't just joining a church, they were joining something bigger than themselves. They were joining a family. Rick Cordell, who had been a member, recalled that his message was always very stark: brotherhood, all races together. You were accepted just as you were. This, in a time of hostility for many, was exactly what they needed. The Cold War started soon after the end of World War II in 1945, when the wartime alliance between Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union began to fall apart. Tensions rose during the Potsdam Conference, Jones, where Allies negotiated on the joint occupation of Germany. And in 1949, the American monopoly on the atomic bomb ended when the Soviet Union detonated their first atomic bomb, starting the nuclear arms race. This caused a huge influx in nuclear anxiety as the chance of nuclear war grew stronger and stronger. The influx of fear and anxiety around the event impacted many people, including Jim Jones, already suffering with paranoia around the increased amount of people leaving his church, believing some even looked for a replacement pastor within some of his closest confidants. His paranoia was at a new all-time high. And in 1961, he claimed to have a vision, one where nuclear apocalypse would happen, and to be safe, they needed to leave Indiana. Whether it was his anxiety around the nuclear war or just a way to isolate his followers to make them more compliant, Jones scoured for a place to move his congregation to. So, when the Esquire magazine, which he frequently read, published 9 places in the world to hide in January of 1962, Jones weighed his options, eventually planning to move to California. In 1965, Jones and a portion of his followers finally moved. He had tried his best to persuade everyone, telling them that if they stayed in Indiana, they would be victims to a nuclear apocalypse. No one would survive the blast. The only way to stay safe was to leave with him. Despite this, only a couple of hundred would follow him, and even when they did arrive, Jones encouraged his followers to write back to their church mate and tell them about the wonderful time they were having in California. For some, the letters worked and a few more made the trip down to California, but the numbers were still significantly less than back in Indiana. California wasn't the perfect paradise either. The area they had moved to wasn't as progressive as Jim had claimed it was, even with the civil rights movement underway. From neighbors ignoring them to businesses giving them subpar service. Nevertheless, the People's Temple kept growing, with more and more people attending sermons and becoming members. Jones' reach expanded even further as he forged connections with the press and politicians. This was surprising, as in America at the time, socialism was despised, and Jones preached just that. He was inspired by Marxism and other communist and socialist ideals. The political popularity he gained would begin to take a toll on his already fragile psyche. He grew even more paranoid, believing the government was infiltrating his church and planned to assassinate some of his people. During this time, Jones's demands began to grow. Already, seniors had to hand over everything to the church, from their life savings to their retirement checks. Even those who weren't seniors had to hand over every paycheck and would just receive an allowance. Jones made it very clear his followers owed him everything. He even made out as if he was his own deity, and many of his followers believed everything he said were true and were happy to follow his word. They had no reason to believe that Jones was doing this maliciously. They believed he was a man of God who could be trusted with their best interest. During the 1970s, the People's Temple would reach its peak membership. It was even estimated to have thousands of members. Yet, as the popularity began growing, so did the opposition. Rumors began to circulate, from sleep deprivation as a loyalty test to intense punishment for those who disagreed with him. The reality of Jim Jones was beginning to show, and more publications were reporting on how the loving and accepting Reverend Jim Jones had a darker side. This got under Jones's skin, and then in 1973, the group came under investigation. With his growing obsession of controlling the people in the church and his escalating paranoia, Jones decided to move his congregation even further, somewhere out of reach of the American government, somewhere where he could have the utmost control, somewhere he could isolate his followers so much that they relied on him to live. Furthermore, Jones would be made aware about an expose to be published about him. With this in mind, he decided he was going to move his congregation deep into the jungle. In 1974, the People's Temple were granted a lease by the Ghanaian government for a plot of land. Jones sent a few of his most loyal followers to the jungle first. They were tasked with clearing the area and preparing the land for the rest of the members to join them. They spent their days cutting down trees and building what the congregation would need to survive in the jungle. It was going to be a paradise, and they named it Jonestown. In 1977, a day before the aforementioned expose was going to be released, Jones would move his family and a few hundred of his followers deep into the Guyanese jungle, leaving their lives in America behind. And at first, it seemed to be the paradise that he had promised. Jim Jones Jr. would even discuss how they had organizational structure from an agricultural team, education projects, the infirmary. It was a whole community. However, there were concerning actions even at the beginning. Visas and passports had to be handed over. If you wanted to leave, if you wanted to go and see your family, you would have to go to Jones. Each cabin was filled with bunk beds, where residents of Jonestown would be crowded together. Furthermore, married couples would be separated, as the cabins were segregated by gender. Settlers were required to work long days of hard labor, tending to fields of food to try and keep the settlement alive. Some even working up to 11-hour days, made even harder by the uncomfortable temperature. The heat in Guyana was brutal to live in, made no better by the humidity from the sea. The settlement deep in the jungle gave no relief. No chance of running into the sea, a lack of air conditioning, and a lack of easy access to water made cooling down nearly impossible. Everyone had a role in Jonestown, whether farmers, cooks, or even engineers, and they were expected to fulfill this role to their best ability to keep the community self-sufficient. Everyone had to pitch in, everyone but Jones. Jones had implemented loudspeakers all across the settlement. He would drone on through these speakers, giving endless speeches. And they didn't just stop when the day came to an end. He would even talk throughout the night. And after grueling long days of work, members would just have to try and sleep through it. And regularly, even the nights weren't even safe. Jim Jones, in his paranoia, would begin preparing. Whether it was the idea of an attack from the Guyana defense or mercenaries, even hostile relatives, Jones believed it was better to die at their own hand than at the hands of others. So, as stated on San Diego's website about the events of Jonestown, the term White Knight has a number of definitions depending on the person using that term, and the amount of White Knights that occurred are also debatable depending on the definition you use. Jones would, however, keep members up throughout the night after long days of work just to talk about concerns, and on around 2 occasions he would have his members arm themselves with weapons, staying up for multiple days at a time. Jones mentioned death in multiple of his speeches, and mass suicide was a recurring theme throughout them too. One thing was for sure: if the worst was to happen, Jones wanted people to be willing to die for their cause. Deborah Layton Blakely, a survivor, would discuss how we were informed that our situation had become hopeless and that the only course of action open to us was mass suicide for the glory of socialism. Jones would tell them about the torture members would face by external forces, further pushing members into the belief that there was no way out. Jones would also prop up volunteers as security throughout. These loyal members of the People's Temple would patrol around, armed with machetes and even guns. Though, other than the fact that there were armed guards, I couldn't find much else other than a few bits and pieces that I couldn't find other sources to back up. But it's just important to understand that there were people dedicated to the protection of Jonestown, both from people infiltrating it and those who wanted to leave. Back in the United States, families were growing restless. Letters, when they even left Jonestown, were censored. Every word was filtered through Jones's control, and silence was more often the news. Relatives had reason to worry. The move to Guyana had come just as reports of the abuse faced by temple members were beginning to come out. And if that abuse had existed in California under the scrutiny of US government and press, what might be happening now with Jones far away from that scrutiny? Even ex-members were concerned. They knew what Jones was capable of, and in Guyana there was no one looking over his shoulder. It would soon all come to a head over the custody of a child. Him and Grace Stoen were loyal members of the People's Temple. However, Grace would have a child with Jones. In his words, it was because Grace and Tim had come to him asking for a son, as Tim couldn't have children. However, this is just one version of the story and it comes from Jim Jones, so take it with a pinch of salt. Tim signed an affidavit stating that Jones was the biological father. However, it isn't completely confirmed that Jones was the dad. The two didn't think at the time that they would ever leave the temple. However, they did in fact do just that. Grace left first, fighting for the custody of her child, who got taken to Jonestown with Jones and Tim. Tim would start by fighting alongside Jones. However, he too would eventually leave the temple and join his wife in the custody battle. A San Francisco court ordered that Grace should have custody of the child. Though, when Tim went to go and retrieve him, Jones refused, threatening that if anyone tried to enter Jonestown to take the child, the settlement would commit mass suicide. Even at this point, the idea of the entire settlement taking their own lives was something that Jones believed he could make happen, and something that outside forces were obviously concerned about. Eventually, Tim's visa would be revoked and he would return back to the US without his child. This is when the most well-known White Night would occur. Jones would call all the members of the People's Temple into a meeting, just like all the others. He had a bowl of fruit punch, apparently poisoned, and called everyone forwards to drink, only to tell them afterwards that it was a test of loyalty and that they would all live another day. Back in the USA, the concerned relatives group was strong. Relatives and ex-temple members had banded together to try and push the US government to do something, and one congressman was concerned with what he was hearing and stepped up to do just that. Congressman Ryan had heard the concern and allegations from the concerned relatives group and decided that it was time that someone investigated. So in autumn of 1978, Congressman Ryan would visit Guyana with a delegation of government officials and members of the press, all to investigate the happenings of Jonestown. It would be November the 14th when the 20-member delegation would arrive in Guyana, arriving in Jonestown a few days later, which was a long drive from the airstrip. Jones welcomed the group with open arms. His charisma was on full show. Ryan and Jackie Spear began with interviewing those whose families back at home had expressed concern. All of the people interviewed expressed no issues. They seemed happy, and that happiness didn't seem coached either. For Ryan, it seemed like for many of the people of Jonestown, this was the best thing that had ever happened to them. But the facade would soon crumble. One of the members of Jonestown had tried passing a note to Ryan asking him to get them out, but Jones had spent a year training the people of Jonestown to tell him when others were breaking the rules, especially if they were thinking of leaving. So when one of the children in Jonestown saw this, he quickly ran to tell someone, and soon the fresh paint on Jonestown began peeling, revealing what was hiding underneath. The next day, everything seemed almost normal, though Jones wouldn't show for breakfast. Ryan and Spear would begin their next round of interviews, and in the meantime, Marceline, Jones's wife, was showing reporters and the TV crews around Jonestown. At first, as always, it was going great. The reporters were surprised with the medical equipment, including incubators and respirators. It wasn't as primitive as they had expected, but everything was too perfect. It was unsettling. Jones would eventually make an appearance. claiming that if the defectors had expressed wanting to leave earlier, they could have. Though before he could leave, Congressman Ryan would be attacked by a member of Jonestown with a knife. The man was pulled away from Ryan before he could do any harm, but it left the congressman rightfully shaken, and he set off with his group and the defectors back to the airship. One member of Jonestown would hop on last minute, and while members would voice their confusion, the truck set out as planned. What the leavers didn't know was that a truck with around 7 men armed with guns was right on their tail, and the fall of Jonestown would soon begin. When they reached the airstrip, Ryan would split the groups onto the 2 planes, the last minute defector being on one of them, and he was called Larry Layton. The reason his last minute defection had stirred confusion was because Larry was loyal, one of the most loyal to Jones and Jonestown. He would manage to sneak a pistol onto the plane with him, one plan in mind: kill as many as he could. To him, everyone that had boarded that plane was a traitor. He would proceed to pull the gun out and shoot. He shot and wounded 2 of the defectors, Gosney and Bagby, before the others managed to subdue him. Thankfully, the 2 would survive that ordeal. The group that had been hot on the tails of the defectors exited their truck as Ryan and the others on the airstrip began to board. They aimed and fired. 5 people died in the shooting, including Congressman Leo Ryan, photographer Greg Robinson, cameraman Bob Brown, reporter Don Harris, and a defector named Patricia Parks. Many others were also severely wounded, with multiple having to crawl their way into the jungle to escape. The crew would quickly get back on the truck. It was likely that the main target was Ryan, and so their mission was over, and they headed back to Jonestown, where the final moments had already began. Around 4 p.m. in Jonestown, everyone would be called to the pavilion. Armed guards surrounded it, patrolling as people gathered. There was a delay in Jones appearing, which caused even more worry in the crowd of people who were already confused. When he did arrive, he told them all that one of the people on the plane was going to shoot the pilot, and down comes the plane into the jungle. He claimed that he didn't plan it, he just knew, and that they would all be blamed. He continued claiming that people would be coming for them, that the only way now was to commit a revolutionary act, as he referred to it, a final white night. Not everyone believed that this was it. Christine Miller would be caught on tape asking about other options. How could it possibly make sense to kill everyone because a few people had left? Jones would respond telling her that someday everybody dies, and that he wanted to choose his own kind of death. Though it hit his head as the truck returned to Jonestown, the people leaving it shouting that they got the congressman, that they were all dead. Jones used this. Now the people in the town were aware that authorities would be coming, and that there was a chance they would all be brandished as murderers because of the few that did kill. Jones wanted it to start with the children, so babies, infants, and children were lined up. Syringes full of the mixture of flavor-aid, tranquilizers, and cyanide were squirted into their mouths. Jones told the armed men that if parents wanted to join their children, they could also join the line. Many children were screaming and crying, some of the adults too. Many of them didn't want to die there and then, especially not by the then mystery concoction, but they were surrounded by armed men, and it was obvious no one was getting out alive. Most were too tired to spend their last moments fighting. Even the elderly who couldn't move were dosed by nurses and guards with syringes. One elderly survivor, Hyacinth Thrash, was asleep during the time, surviving only because they thought she was already dead. By the time authorities arrived, bodies littered the floor. Over 909 people would lose their lives in Jonestown, another 9 dying elsewhere on that day, bringing the total fatalities up to 918. The armed guards, the nurses, and the group that had killed Ryan were dead alongside the population of Jonestown, and in the center lay the man who made it all happen. Jim Jones was dead, a single gunshot to the head. Whether it was homicide or suicide was never actually determined. Before we dive in, I want to make it clear that I am not a professional psychologist or an expert in cult dynamics. The information I am sharing comes from peer-reviewed articles accessed through my university's library or Google Scholar. I study forensic psychology, and I genuinely believe that it's important to examine cases like Jonestown through a psychological lens, not to excuse what happened, but to understand it, because the people involved weren't just brainwashed. They were victims of manipulation, coercion, and long-term psychological abuse. If this kind of breakdown isn't your thing, which I completely understand, feel free to skip ahead using the time code on screen or with the chapter markers below. One of the most powerful tools that Jim Jones used was isolation. Members of the People's Temple were constantly on the move, shifting cities, states, and eventually even countries. With every relocation, they lost more and more connections to the outside world. Friends and family were left behind, and new connections were made solely within the temple. This wasn't just logistics, it was strategic. The fewer outside voices they had, the harder it was to hear reason. In 2017, psychologist Russler and colleagues interviewed ex-cult members to explore reasons why people join and stay in high-control religious groups. One of the most common reasons being dependence. Many described being emotionally and physically dependent on the group or its leader. They'd given up jobs, abandoned education, distanced themselves from loved ones. By the time they wanted to leave, they had no safety net to fall back on. This experience mirrors what many Jonestown survivors would describe years later, and what many victims suffered in silence. After the massacre, many bodies were never claimed. Some families simply couldn't afford it, others were too afraid or ashamed to acknowledge the connection. Because as terrifying as life in a cult can be for some, facing the world alone was even scarier. Psychologists Linda and Roderick Dubrow Marshall discussed this in Cults and Mental Health, referencing the work of Robert J. Lifton, the man who coined the term milieu control in 1961. Lifton studied the process of thought reform in post-World War II China and identified 8 key themes used to manipulate belief and behavior. The first, total control of communication. This didn't mean just restricting outside contact. It meant monitoring conversation, encouraging members to spy on each other, and creating a culture where privacy didn't exist. The second theme, undue influence through language, is what Lifton called loading the language. Leaders simplify complex ideas into black and white thinking. Us versus them, good versus evil. Inside the temple, Jones constantly fed this kind of language to his followers. They were chosen, enlightened, persecuted by the outside world. Over time, these beliefs weren't just accepted, they became a part of the person's identity. Group membership replaced independent thought. The final elements of Lifton's framework are doctrine over the person and dispensing of existence. Personal needs, family, work, even education, all of it was abandoned. Members gave up who they were to become who the group needed them to be. Many people in the People's Temple even handed over all of their earnings while in the US to Jones, believing that that's what their God would have wanted them to do, leaving them with nothing the group. And when the time came to move out of the country, many didn't hesitate. They weren't just following Jones, they were following a worldview that had consumed them entirely. For most of us, the groups that we belong to shape who we are, often more than we've realized. Whether it's family, culture, religion, community, the social identities that we carry can influence how we dress, what we eat, what we believe, even what we're willing to accept. Psychologists Tajfel and Turner were among the first to explore this social identity theory, showing how we naturally divide the world into in-group and out-group dynamics. The people inside our group feel familiar, safe, and trustworthy, but those on the outside are deemed suspicious and dangerous. In 2012, researcher Coates published a study on cult commitment, where interviewees consistently describe the need to do what the group does to belong. No one was technically forcing them to stay, but they also didn't feel truly free to leave. As one participant said, "You just couldn't go. You feel like you're stuck there." But it wasn't just the need to belong. In 2011, Ward explored the lived experiences of spiritual abuse, identifying 6 common themes across different groups, the most prominent being leadership representing God. Jim Jones never outright claimed divinity, but he didn't need to. He claimed to be the reincarnation of Jesus, Buddha, Lenin, even Father Divine. Followers called him Father, some even going as far as to call him Dad. Ward found that members were far more willing to tolerate manipulation and abuse when they believed that the leader's authority was God-given. To them, disobeying Jones wasn't just wrong, it was blasphemy. Both Ward and Coates discussed the way that cult leaders manufacture dependency. Ward's participants described their treatment as not unlike that of a chastening parent, a mix of punishment and affection. Jones mirrored this dynamic perfectly. Forced confessions, restricted relationships, public shaming, blackmail, and manipulation. He created an environment where people felt powerless to act and grateful to stay. And when you're isolated, emotionally exhausted, and made to believe that your leader is divine, sometimes just being allowed to leave doesn't feel like an option at all. Another aspect to think about is the impact that perceived authority can have. Famously, Milgram conducted a study whereby the participant, the teacher, was made to believe that they were delivering electrical shocks to a learner in another room whenever they got the answer wrong. The shocks got higher and higher every time, and the learner would be heard screaming, begging, and eventually just silent. As the shocks went up to a lethal amount, the participants were under the assumption that this was completely real, and anytime they wanted to back out, there was an experimenter in the room that would encourage them to continue. 100% of the participants continued up to 300 volts, where the learner would pound on the wall. It was at 330 volts that the learner would go silent. Despite this, 65% still continued to the highest level of voltage of 450 volts. Milgram would conclude that people are more obedient to authority figures than they may think, even if it means that obeying causes harm. He also found out that people are willing to harm others if the responsibility can be passed on to someone else. In the case of Jonestown, Jones was the ultimate authority. In comparison to Milgram's experimenter, who was a stranger in a lab coat, Jones was a trusted leader and for many a living prophet. To those in the people's temple, his words were commandment. This gave him absolute authority. While in Milgram's study, participants could return to their normal lives afterwards, members of Jonestown didn't have an afterwards. Life revolved around Jones's approval, and like in Milgram's study, obedience was often easier when responsibility could be shifted. Many members could convince themselves that they were just following orders, then the consequences, even death, weren't truly on them. That responsibility belonged to the father. By the time Jones started speaking openly about revolutionary suicide, obedience wasn't just simply a learned habit, it was an act of loyalty. To disobey was to betray the group, the cause, and in their eyes, the moral order of the universe. And Jones knew this. He cultivated it and he weaponized it. What we've covered here are just a fraction of the psychological forces at play in Jonestown. Isolation, social identity, obedience, and dependency. These are only some of the mechanisms researchers have identified in high control groups. There are other theories, other perspectives that can shed light on how something like this can happen. Understanding the psychology behind it doesn't excuse the tragedy, but it does strip away the myth that those who died were simply brainwashed. They were manipulated, coerced, and abused until resistance felt impossible. And if we can recognize those mechanisms in the past, maybe we can see them in the present before they reach the same end. Most of the people responsible for the events of the day had died along with the others, and so couldn't be brought to justice. However, Larry Layton had survived. He was extradited to the US, where he would stand trial for conspiracy to murder a member of Congress. A second jury would convict him, and he would serve up to 18 years in prison. Sadly, most of the bodies would be given nothing more than a cursory identification if possible, and families were notified to make arrangements for disposal themselves, something which would cost a lot of money, of which many of these families didn't have. Many bodies were never identified or even claimed. The 408 bodies are buried at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland. Originally, the Guyana Emergency Relief Committee placed a simple gravestone reading in memory of the victims of the Jonestown tragedy, though it failed to provide closure for the families and dignity for those who had passed. Fundraising for a memorial, though it would take years, would eventually pay for 2 stones, listing a sampling of victims' names and ages. Though this would cause controversy as it listed the name of Jim Jones. It was argued that placing his name on that list was like placing Hitler's on a Holocaust memorial. But others would argue if they excluded him, they should exclude the people who assassinated Leah Ryan. And in doing that, the people who were complicit should also be excluded. And eventually, the lawsuit filed would be dismissed. Each year at Evergreen Cemetery on November the 18th, a memorial is held to remember those who have lost their lives. Those who survived the tragedy would return to the US, though not to sympathy but stigma. They would face harassment from people and even lose jobs over simply having been a part of the People's Temple, brandished as murderers and baby killers rather than victims of manipulation and control. Many would continue to live together for several months, being the support for one another before building back their lives. They would face lack of food, housing, and financial support, as reported in a newspaper article by the News Times in 1979. Many of the survivors had refused to speak to the press. The trauma too raw to return to so soon. Eventually, many survivors managed to find work or return to school, slowly building back their lives. Years later, surviving members have reunions. Though sadly for some of the survivors, the trauma and the stigma that followed them home would be too much, and they would proceed to take their own lives. One survivor, Eugene Smith, in an interview with NBC News, would tell them, "None of us are survivors. We just got away. For all of us who were not in Jonestown, part of us died there." It's essential to look back on what happened, not as a warning or a thing to be studied, but to remember those who never made it out of Jonestown, to remember the tragedy as more than an insensitive catchphrase, and to read the words of those who survived to tell their story. I think it's important to remember that the people of Jonestown were not just brainwashed cult members. They were mothers, fathers, children, friends, people who were manipulated and ultimately trapped in a nightmare they didn't choose. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the events of Jonestown. If you found it informative or thought-provoking, please consider giving the video a like, as it helps the video reach more people. And if you'd like to see more videos exploring dark history, psychology, and real-world mysteries, you can subscribe to this channel and press the bell below so you don't miss any future uploads. I would also love to hear your thoughts on the psychology of Jonestown, your perspective on the events we've discussed, or just your thoughts and feelings on the video as a whole. Feel free to leave a comment down below. I read them all. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, lovelies, and I will see you all very, very soon.